The Jewish community in Europe, or what remains of it, has survived the trauma of World War II. But is it a journey into an extinguished past if we try and recapture it? Has the old Jewish world gone forever? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
With the fall of Nazi Germany came the end of World War II. However, years of systemic destruction of Europe's Jewish population on Adolf Hitler's orders have reduced its numbers to a fraction of what it once was. Prior to the breakout of World War II, approximately 9.5 million Jews lived on the old continent, making up 60% of the world's Jewish population. The Holocaust saw around 6 million Jews lose their lives at the hands of the Nazi regime, whether through gas chambers and death camps or mass shootings. According to historical records, only a third of the Jewish population remained in Europe after the war, with over 50% of all Jews choosing to live in the Americas. The United States, Canada, and other Western states gradually started accepting thousands of Jewish refugees who, due to lingering anti-Semitism and having no home to return to, had lived in displaced person camps. However, in May of 1948, the Jews would finally get a home of their own: Israel. The establishment of a Jewish state offered hope to both displaced European Jews as well as Jews persecuted in Arab countries. Between 1948 and the early 1950s, over 700,000 Jews immigrated to the new state, with more following in the years after. Nowadays, the Jewish population is nearing 16 million, 7 of which live in Israel, and between 6 and 7.5 million choose the US as their home. Despite the devastating effects of the Holocaust and decades of anti-Semitic persecution, the Jewish people persist.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Frankee Lyons. She is a US Fulbright scholar and a historian of post-war Jewish history. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
We've covered the immediate post-war 1945-47 period in the Jewish experience, and then moved on to the 1968. But your speciality is the 1950s. So can you just tell us briefly why that's important and why it interests you?
Sure. I focus on Jewish life in Poland around 1956, focusing on the impact of the thaw on Poland's Jewish community. So 1956 is a very important moment for Polish Jews because it led to two really profound events in terms of migration and opportunities for personal mobility. So the first is a 1956 agreement between Poland and the Soviet Union allowing for the repatriation of Polish citizens, pre-war Polish citizens to Poland. And this included about 40,000 Jews. And also 1956 saw the introduction of a exit-only visa to Israel leading to a migration called the Gomułka Aliyah, which led to the outward emigration of about 50,000 Jews. So 1956 to 1960, you have this influx and outflux of about 50,000 people. And this had a profound impact on the Jewish community. For many of these repatriates from the Soviet Union, it was just a stopover to further emigration out of Poland. But for Jews living in Poland before 1956, it raised questions about the possibility of further rebuilding of a Jewish community, of the invigoration of new people and possibilities. So you see a rebuilding of public Jewish spaces and life with community centers, seeing much more excitement and activity after 1956 for a couple of years.
We'll come into that in a minute because that's a fascinating interlude in this chronology. What was the rationale for letting not pre-war Polish citizens, including many Jews, out of the USSR? One of my great aunts was one of them. Right. She was in Kazakhstan, and she was a Polish girl, and they let her out. Why would they have done that 10 years after the war ended? Right.
So this 1956 agreement led to this migration, often called the second repatriation. So the first happened, as you said, about 10 years earlier. But after the fall of the Iron Curtain in the late 1940s, many people were stuck in Stalinist labor camps, for example, in the Soviet Union. Some people simply had found employment or a partner and had started building a family. Yeah. And the immediacy of the need to leave in that moment was maybe not clear. So they become stuck in the Soviet Union. And so in 1956, with this new agreement, you see people who had been maybe stuck for 10 years in the Soviet Union take this opportunity now. And many of these people did not identify necessarily as Polish anymore, especially if they've been born or the children of pre-war Polish citizens, but had been raised in the Soviet Union, speaking Russian, for example.
Yes. From your researches, what can we gain anything from how they felt, how they saw the world that they came into, this Poland that they were either settling in or transiting from?
Yeah.
What did they think of it?
Yeah, coming from the Soviet Union, many of these Jewish repatriates in particular saw Poland as offering better economic opportunities, especially for Jews. There is greater opportunity for them to open Jewish businesses, for example. So in Lower Silesia, which had the greatest concentration of these Jewish repatriates after 1956, you see the opening of Jewish bakeries and restaurants and other sorts of enterprises. This was not possible in the Soviet Union in 1956. A lot of this was reaction to anti-Semitism that developed in the early 1950s in the Soviet Union. Poland became a beacon of opportunity and openness for these Jewish repatriates. In particular, for Yiddish publishing, Warsaw became the center of Yiddish publishing in the mid to late 1950s because of this openness with the thaw in Poland.
And was there any reaction by the surviving Jewish community to these newcomers? What were the relations between the two?
Yeah, for local community leaders who had been struggling to rebuild a community life, this was an opportunity to reinvigorate Yiddish publishing, newspapers, for example, radio broadcasts. But it was a challenge. People didn't all speak the same language, so schools had to focus on teaching adults and children Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, to create a community that could speak the same language. But also different experiences of the Holocaust had a profound impact on the rebuilding of this community. Many of those Jews in Poland before 1956 had experienced the death and concentration camps, for example. But those who had fled into the Soviet Union during the war and had stayed there until 1956 did not experience that. They didn't experience the Holocaust in the same way. And so creating this shared memory was very difficult as well.
Were they expected to share the same memories, being Jewish, or 10 years after this was a completely new, a different experience that they had gone through?
I would say at first, no, they were not expected to share the same memory. But I think a big element of trying to build a cohesive Jewish community was trying to create a shared narrative. But this was very difficult at the time.
Now, we have 50,000 repatriates coming in, a very small existing Jewish surviving community. What were the factors in persuading people to stay, and what were the factors in persuading them, or perhaps encouraging them to leave, to treat Poland as a transit point into other places in the world?
Sure. Well, this was a profound debate among different Jewish organizations, and not every organization saw it the same way. So there were international organizations operating in Poland in 1957 onward, including the American Joint Distribution Committee, which saw its priority as not only being material aid to repatriates in the Jewish community, but also the encouragement of emigration, primarily to Israel. Then you have the Sociocultural Association of Jews in Poland, which was the only recognized Jewish group in Poland under communism. And the leaders of this group saw its future lying in these repatriates, and so they really encouraged community and cultural programming to encourage Jews to stay, basically saying, Israel's not your only homeland.
Same debate that happened before the war, I suppose.
Absolutely, exactly the same. Israel's not your only homeland. You don't have to leave. We can build, Doikite here in Poland, a possibility for a socialist-driven Jewish community, of course, but still Jewish in its character. Yeah.
A final question to you before we go on to our next clip. To be Jewish and to be a socialist,
yes.
How do you define being Jewish in that respect? Were these practicing Jews, or how did they look to Poland as being a former bourgeois and anti-Semitic country? So they were able to be Jewish and communist or socialist at the same time.
Sure.
How does
This is a very nuanced question. I think in the context of the period I'm talking about, many of these repatriates were people who had survived in the Soviet Union, but not necessarily because they were socialist or communist, but out of circumstance. The leaders of these local community groups in Poland that are welcoming these repatriates may not necessarily feel themselves to be that Jewish. And when we talk about Jewishness, are we talking about religious identity, cultural identity, all of these different elements of it? I would say in this instance it's cultural, primarily. They had to compromise to some extent in terms of welcoming religious expressions of Jewishness. After 1956, many repatriates from the Soviet Union were more religious than the community before 1956. So you also see this reinvigoration of religious life. But that was a compromise for many of the other leaders who had been in Poland.
Yeah.
And so I would say that there was absolutely a belief that you could have a socialist politic and a Jewish identity. But for every person or every group, it was slightly different. Yeah.
We'll take a look at our next clip now, and then we'll continue our discussion after the mid-1950s.
Great.
While the end of World War II meant peace in Europe, it did not bring about the end of the Jewish people's suffering, especially in Eastern Europe. Left to fend for themselves in Soviet-controlled territories, the experience of being a Jew was a blend of repression, survival, and identity loss. While the Holocaust killed the people, the Soviet regime killed their cultures and religion's revival. Officially, the Soviet Union condemned anti-Semitism. However, in practice, being Jewish was shunned, viewed through a lens of suspicion, especially when Joseph Stalin was still in charge. Jews were frequently accused of disloyalty to the state, materializing into conspiracies such as the infamous Doctors' Plot, in which Moscow-based Jewish doctors were falsely accused of plotting to kill Soviet leaders. After Stalin's death in 1953, all charges were dropped by the new Soviet leadership. In Soviet-controlled states like Poland, Romania, and Hungary, Jewish communities were closely monitored. Religious practice was discouraged, and Zionism was labeled a form of Western subversion, leading many to abandon their faith to avoid persecution. The establishment of the State of Israel would finally give Jews a place to call home, where they could freely practice their religion. This, combined with waves of Jewish immigration to Western states, meant Jewish presence in Eastern Europe was further reduced. It wasn't until the fall of communism that Jews could begin slowly reviving their religion and culture in Eastern Europe. Nowadays, 36 years after the fall of the communist regimes, Jews in Eastern and Central Europe can fully be themselves, not bound by a hostile entity to hide their heritage.
You mentioned this concept of the Gomułka Aliyah.
Yeah.
The exodus, if we can put it that way.
Yeah.
Sure. Mixing my biblical metaphors.
Yeah.
How many people actually felt this and were able to go from Poland in 1956 to 58?
About 50,000 people left between 1956 and 1959. Yeah, I feel like I rushed through a lot of that in my answer at the beginning, but this visa law that was passed, some people felt, like it was a push out. They had to leave, this exodus
because of the
feeling.
You mentioned this kind of nationalist
turn
surge in the 50s. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like this moment of possibility with the thaw in 1956 ends quite quickly. And then that's when the emigration numbers really peak. And so by the end of the 50s, it's 50,000 people just under this visa law in 56.
And where did they go? What did they find in Israel? Is that just too general a question?
Well, this visa law, as I said, was exit only to Israel. Applicants had to say that they were going to Israel even if they did not intend to go to Israel or want to go to Israel. It was a very, nationalizing visa law. Some did something called dropping out. So these trains would be organized between the Israeli and Polish governments and bring these migrants from Poland through Vienna, Italy, and then on ferries primarily to Haifa. And so many people would drop out and just leave the trains in Vienna, for example, and then try to go somewhere else. For those who ended up going to Israel, thousands applied to go back to Poland within the first year of arriving in Israel. Many felt that, the climate was too hot, they didn't speak Hebrew, and maybe they felt, I'm not that Jewish actually being in Israel. I felt more Jewish being in Poland. And also, after the repatriation from the Soviet Union, many people got to Poland and saw, they looked around at their community, they looked around at Poland, and they felt, maybe I'm more Soviet than I am Polish now, right? Yes. And so all of these new contexts bring out these different feelings of not belonging. I think the most important thing to understand about post-war Polish Jewish history, post-Holocaust Jewish history, is that the war didn't end in 1945 for any citizen of Poland, but I would say especially for Jews. This feeling of displacement continues for people their entire lives. And you can see in the story of these 1956 migrants in particular, that this search for safety settlements continues, at every step.
And what was the impact on Israel, and what was the impact on 50,000 Jews leaving Poland?
Yeah.
How would you judge the loss of that community?
I don't know how to judge the loss of that. I think at the end of the 60s, you see what is left behind is largely, we could say, assimilated secular Jewish community that maybe expresses Jewishness or Jewish identity less publicly, or considers it less central to their identity, as in 56. And so the nature of the community is quite different. And the question of building a publicly and expressly Jewishness in Poland kind of ends, and especially ends after 1968, but you can really see that process already happening in 1960. And in terms of the migrants arriving in Israel, again, many found it quite hostile. Of course, people adapt, right? People learn the local language and they learn to cook the local food and build their family there, but it was quite difficult for most of these migrants. And so through the 60s, you see Polish language newspapers still being published in Israel, appealing to these new immigrants, these Olim. And these newspapers show that people felt still a quite intense affinity, kinship to Poland. You can see people publishing columns, poems, reflecting on, their memories of pre-war Poland, but also, expressing feelings of I would love to go back if I could, even just to visit.
Are there any generational differences between this generation of the immediate post-war exodus, the 1950s, and then 1968? Did they have different mentalities, do you think, or did they come in successive waves into Israel to influence the economy, the country?
Well, you do see that each wave becomes more secular, more assimilated than the last, of course culminating in the 68 generation of people who either did not know that they had Jewish ancestry or did not feel close to it. And so you do see that change over the generations in particular. And I think increasingly people felt that they had to pick one or the other. you're Polish or you're Jewish. And I think that this is something that was absolutely imposed on people. It wasn't a natural thing coming from their actual lived experience. It was from the surroundings around them, I would say.
It seems that sophisticated world has gone.
Yeah.
When you could have multiple
absolutely
identities.
Yeah.
And what from your research here in Poland, how would you judge the? Is there such a thing, or can there be such a thing as a Jewish revival, given these emigrations and given the Holocaust? I think everybody knows of someone who's rediscovered their Jewish roots, and they're trying to. Is it a world that's has been lost forever, and are we just grasping at a kind of an imagined life? Are there any connections that are still there?
Yeah. The Jewish world that existed in Poland before 1939 can never return. But I think the continued resilience of people being interested in their Jewish heritage, or maybe not having any at all, but still becoming involved in preserving Jewish heritage and life here, is incredibly important. And I think it's this debate over whether the Jewish revival in Poland is legitimate. Is it a real revival of anything, or is it a hollow performance of Jewishness? I think is less important than the efforts to preserve memory.
The last question now is about you as a researcher. Yeah. You're researching into Eastern Europe, traditionally probably a very difficult place to get all the archives and the memories. How do you go about digging out these experiences of individuals, not just communities? Absolutely.
It can be incredibly difficult to do this, especially from this period of the 1950s, when, first of all, there was a pressure for many Jewish people to hide elements of their Jewishness.
Colonize their surnames, perhaps.
Colonize their surnames, exactly. I work with security records, but you have to read between the lines of those, right? But the Polish state, for example, was really intensely following and surveilling the Jewish community in Poland. But that can be an interesting resource. The Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw has amazing personal records of people involved in the organization from that period. And I think the most important type of source to get at this history is personal letters. Because I think that there's a really common misconception that the Jewish community in Poland under communism was entirely isolated. It was cut off from the world, like Poland was under the Iron Curtain. Well, people were in communication with friends and family over the world during the communist period, especially Jewish people in Poland. And so people were sending letters to the United States, to Western Europe, to Israel constantly. And this also informed how they saw themselves in Poland. And so by looking at these personal letters, we can better understand how they saw themselves belonging in Poland or not.
It's kind of almost a shame that they're all scattered to the four winds. Dr. Lyons, thank you very much indeed for coming on to the programme.
Thank you so much.
So that's all we have time for today. Join us again, you know the time. See you then.